If I could introduce our speaker, Dr. Sara Goldrick-Rab is the author of Paying the Price, College Costs, Financial Aid, and the Betrayal of the American Dream, Senior Fellow at Education Northwest, Sociology Professor at the Community College of Philadelphia, and founder of Believe in Students, the hashtag Real College Movement, and the original Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice. Sara's talk today is titled Learning from Students, How Longitudinal Mixed Methods Research Can Change What We Know. Please join me in welcoming Sara Goldrick-Rab. Sara, over to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me today. Thank you to the organizers. I know how much work goes into these things. I am delighted to be with all of you. I am going to use some slides, so let me just go ahead and get that started. Bear with me for just a moment. Okay. And somebody let me know verbally if you can't see the slides, but otherwise I'll go ahead and get started with a couple of formative kind of stage setting remarks. So one thing that I say a great deal in my work, which has a lot to do with student success in higher education, is that students are humans first. But I'd like to start today by talking a little bit about a corollary there, which is that researchers are also. And as humans, we bring a great deal to our research. It's very clear to me from this series that this is something that you all think a lot about, that when you undertake a study that you are in fact shaping it with who you are. So I want to start by telling you a couple things about myself that would be important to know as I give you my perspectives today and talk about the work that I've done. The first thing is that I'm a sociologist by training, and in fact, I've been a sociologist since I was about 18 years old. I declared my major very early while I was in college, when I discovered that there were classes that would talk about things that had long been on my mind, and that I was able to get new ideas and perspectives on things that mattered to me from an actual field, social science. So you will notice that the way I talk about my assumptions, my methods, and so on, I think are very reflective of the way that sociologists would talk, perhaps less so psychologists or economists. The second thing is that I'm very, very committed to doing actionable social science research. I emphasize that because there are lots of other types of research, and many people are really engaged in theory building. I personally think that while I do engage in small t theory, I don't really do my studies with the goal of building more theory as much as I'm trying to do work that communities of multiple sorts can make use of. I didn't become a researcher to become a researcher. I actually became a researcher because I was interested in finding ways to do what Angela Davis calls changing the things I cannot accept. And so to me, using rigorous research that starts with hypothesis testing is a good way to improve the world. The last thing is that my perspective on what makes for good research has changed over time, particularly as I've moved away from my formal training and really just gotten a lot of pragmatic experience doing research on the ground. And I would say that the three signature attributes of what I think are really good research now are that, number one, they are creative. So I don't think straight out of the box methods or tools can be used as is without some real attention to the need for adaptation, for example. And I think of creativity as a big part of my job, which I don't think a lot of scientists will necessarily say. Secondly, I think flexibility is really key. I think if you're a very rigid researcher who believes there's only one way to do things, then it's possible you just haven't engaged in that much research, especially research with people who will almost inevitably sort of defy your expectations. And the last thing is that I think that we need to do responsive research that accepts and takes seriously what's happening in the real world. So for example, you'll hear me today talk a little bit about randomized control trials. I'm not one of the people who thinks that they are the worst thing in the world, nor do I think that they are the best. I think they have their place, and I think that if they're going to be done well, they can't pretend like people are going to be able to stand still while we research them. I think that we have to accept that they're going to go about their lives, and we therefore have to make responses and changes to our studies in order to capture and understand what they're doing and also allow them to proceed. I think not doing that is going to undermine what we learn from research, and also I think creates a lot of ethical issues. Okay, so with all that said, given all those priorities, for me, longitudinal mixed methods research is my kind of favorite thing to do. If I'm going to do a study, that's the kind of thing I want to do. Doesn't mean I always get to do it. I'll talk later about some of the pragmatic stuff that goes into being able to do this kind of research. I want to fully acknowledge that I spent the majority of my research career working in the kinds of institutions that could largely afford for me to do research in them. So for example, I spent 12 years at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, an absolute research powerhouse that benefits from a big endowment. I also spent some time at Temple University, a much less well-endowed public university where the research infrastructure was not as strong, and I had to make a number of changes and compromises to my work. And now I'm at the Community College of Philadelphia just to teach one class a year, and I don't run any of my research there because, frankly, they have not yet created research infrastructure, although many of the community college faculty there would like to engage in it. So I thought it would be helpful to give you a sense of 3 of my favorite kind of biggest studies that exemplify the longitudinal mixed methods approach. 2 of the 3 are captured in books that I've published. The third one is captured in a book I hope to write someday when I have time that I don't currently have. The first book was titled Putting Poor People to Work. And by the way, that's not a comment on what I think we should do. It's a comment on the policies that we were studying. And it asked a central question that is a pretty complicated question. In a nutshell, we wanted to know what happened to community colleges and their students when 2 major federal policies were passed, both under Democrat Bill Clinton in the 1990s, that exemplified what we might call a work-first ideology governing the lives of low-income women and their kids. And essentially what this said was, if you're going to get out of poverty, we think it's better that we don't just support you and your family, but rather that we also add this expectation that you have work requirements. And it says work first, but it should also say work only, because it also said, and by the way, post-secondary education doesn't really count as work. So I was engaged by my professor at the time in this study. I eventually became a lead of the study with one other colleague. And the way that we designed that study was it was a comparative design. We worked across 6 different states that we had purposefully selected based on their seemingly different understanding of the federal policy. And we collected federal data, state administrative data, and we conducted interviews, often quite lengthy interviews, and focus groups with a huge range of people. So for example, on a given day, you might find me for that study in Tallahassee, Florida, interviewing a state legislator, a Republican who was extremely proud of this legislation and the role that he as a Republican played in it. And at that same day, I could be over at the community college meeting with some moms who used to go to college there but had to leave due to this policy. So we took this giant wealth of data collected over many, many years, and again, using a comparative framework where we did a lot of triangulation of information, we learned a couple of different things. First, despite the assumptions of federal policymakers, even those Democrats, again, who passed this legislation, work first meant work only. That was widely understood not only by the people in Washington who were involved in passing the legislation, but we could actually see those words echoed and the messages reiterated, not only through the state level, but all the way down to the welfare caseworkers level, the people who were implementing the policies. These people would say that they got their messages from the federal government, even though they often had not had any interaction from the federal government. Second thing we learned, students got the message and many of them left college. And in fact, it affected the structures of institutions because college programs that had been serving low-income women with children using partly federal funds had to close. And the last thing is this whole story we came to understand had as much to do with what the frontline workers, as I would call them, the people that students had the most interaction with their understandings and their attitudes. So as a quick example, rather than just believe that what had happened was that somebody read something from the federal government and simply parroted it, what we learned is that in many cases, people internalized the thinking and began to convince themselves that this was, in fact, doing the best possible thing for the people that they wanted to help. This was actually similar to what we were hearing from Bill Clinton as well. He said that the reason he wanted to make these changes was because he had watched his mom grow up in poverty, and he believed that a lot of her struggles were due to a growing dependence on government benefits. And what she needed was not so much a path forward, but a push forward. And we really began to see that in the attitudes of the people working with the students. And there were some who resisted it and some who didn't, but the overall thrust of the narrative was exactly what it seems that federal policymakers had intended. So that's just a snapshot of what that longitudinal and mixed method study was able to tell us. Next, perhaps my best known book and the one that I've been speaking on for the longest period of time is a book called Paying the Price: College Costs, Financial Aid, and the Betrayal of the American Dream. And the central question in that study is one that is on the minds of many, many Americans, which is, to what extent is this system that we've set up, that we've been running for over 50 years, need-based financial aid, to what extent is it actually achieving its goal of making college affordable for the people who need it most? What was really different about this study compared to all prior studies is that we were able to use a method that could help us to sort out whether it was the case that financial aid recipients, particularly Pell Grant recipients, had lower graduation rates because they came in with different characteristics than other students. For example, they were more likely to live in poverty, or whether it is possible that there was a causal effect of financial aid that was actually giving them a boost. In other words, we were able to go further than a simple correlational study and make causal inferences because we were able to conduct a randomized control trial wherein a private scholarship program looked at a giant group of students with need. So this was just far more students than they could ever fund across an entire state. This was in Wisconsin. And instead of just trying to cherry pick who they thought they deserved the help the most, what they did was they put them all into essentially a basket and they flipped a coin. And so one set of students in that bigger group was able to get additional money for college. It added up to over $15,000 during the time they were in college. And the other group did not. And so what I was tasked with doing was studying the effects of that program. And originally, I was told I would just do that with administrative records. And I'm so glad that's not what I did. I did use administrative records. I got their financial aid records. I got their academic transcripts. I got their admissions applications, all sorts of things. Things that we might not have been able to get today because of changes in laws. But in addition, I thought it was incredibly important that we get as close to the student experiences as possible. So just like in the first study where we really listened to these low-income moms who were trying to go to college so that we understood that despite the law, they really wanted to go, here we wanted to know from students, how were they actually experiencing paying for college? And was it the way that policymakers imagined? So we asked a lot of different kinds of questions on surveys, and I'm going to explain a few of those in a bit. You can kind of see what we got from that. And we also did in-depth interviews, and these were not one-time interviews. These were repeated interviews. So we drew a stratified random sample of 50 of the 3,000 students, and we interviewed those 50 students every 6 months. It was realistically, sometimes it was more like 9 or 10 months, but we interviewed them repeatedly over that whole period that you see there of 6 years. So we could really see change over time. And we learned a couple of things. There's a lot more than this than what we learned that's outlined in the book, but these are my top 3 things. First, despite the most common assumption held by so many experts that financial aid makes college affordable, we found that even with additional financial aid, we really still weren't seeing the money problems students had be touched. In other words, aid wasn't enough. And that didn't mean they didn't need money. It's just that the financial aid wasn't very good at getting them money, and it wasn't nearly enough money. Second, the suffering that was going on as a result of those gaps in their need were so much more substantial than what people were talking about. So at the time, if you go back to like 2008, you'll hear people say, well, if students don't have their needs met, then maybe it's that they don't have books for class. We found food and housing insecurity. We found homelessness. This was the first time that anybody had systematically begun to collect data and examine that. And it led to a whole slew of my work for the last 15 years. And then the other thing that we really learned was all these layers of administrative burden that were keeping students from getting money that they needed, from getting it in a timely fashion, and also rules that really kind of undermined the message of the money. So for example, there are rules that say at the end of your first year of college, if you're not making good grades, by the way, that the children of the wealthy don't have to make, but the children of the low-income families do, that you can have your aid taken away. We came to understand that while there's a lot of attention to the FAFSA, which is that big bureaucratic, application form, there was so much administrative burden well beyond the FAFSA. And I lay that all out in great detail in the book. So I hope you can see, again, what the mixed methods got us and what the longitudinal picture was able to help us get to. It took us years to figure out all the different types of red tape that students were facing. Last one, most recent longitudinal study that I led was an evaluation of a program called the College Housing Assistance Program. This one was in Washington State. And here what we were doing was we were looking at homeless and near homeless community college students. So people who were very much at risk of not being able to finish school, people whose well-being was compromised. And we were looking at the potential that a partnership between their community college and the local housing authority, where they were provided with what's called a Section 8 housing voucher, could actually improve their lives. Here again, I was able to use a randomized controlled trial because there weren't nearly enough vouchers. And so students would apply for this support, and some of them would get it and others would not. Something I worried a ton about, what would happen to those who didn't. And we collected an enormous range of data for this. Again, the surveys and the interviews. But in addition to regular college administrative data for this purpose, we were able to obtain state records, and these are extraordinary records. So for example, I was able to observe all the different social service programs that the students were accessing. I was able to observe whether they had been admitted to the emergency room. I was able to see if they had any felonies, arrests, or charges from the criminal justice system. In this case, all of this was de-identified information, of course. It was all done with IRB approval and so on. But what it did is it gave us a really, really detailed perspective on the lives of approximately 300 students so that we could really try to see whether doing this housing program would help them. The students, by the way, would always tell us it helped them. The program would always tell us it helped them. But what we learned was that the story was a lot more complicated. So for example, people who advocated for the program said we give students housing, their graduation rates go up. Well, actually, we didn't see a lot of students graduating. And it turns out it's because the program was not actually working as intended. Getting a voucher and using a voucher to actually sign a lease are two very different things. And the students were again facing so much red tape and so many headaches that they would try and try and try. And yet landlords would discriminate against them, or they'd find out that still the rent was not affordable. So most of the students were never housed. That said, we did have students who got housed. And what we could see was that the students who were housed were living safer, healthier, and more academically successful lives. So this was the first time I was able to really see, for example, it is true. If you keep someone from being homeless and get them into housing, they're less likely to go to the emergency room. They're less likely to experience a felony, arrest, or charge, right? All of these really good things were happening because of a program the community college put together. And this went so far beyond their grades. So a couple of common themes across each of these. I'm sure you can think of many. These are just kind of three big ones. First, essentially the students, the people subject to these policies or receiving the support, they predicted the study results long before anybody else did. So we would say, oh, a student is saying that this is happening or that is happening. And we'd later find out and be able to document that, in fact, that was the case. But I really, really always enjoy that. Had we just listened to the students earlier on, we probably could have saved ourselves a lot of time. Second, the methodological decisions were so important. So a quick example, early in the second study, the study about affordability, we had designed an interview protocol, very much consistent with my training, that we had topics, we wanted to cover those topics, and the interviewers would go in and tick through the questions. And they were coming back and they were giving me information from the students, and I was disheartened because I felt like the students weren't really opening up to us. And I approached a colleague to talk about it, and she said, why don't you get rid of this whole set of questions and instead ask the students some very open-ended basic questions and then follow them where they want to go? And we did. And so our opening question became, how are you? It's now my absolute favorite question to ask a student, of course. And it's the one that got the answer, I'm not okay, I haven't eaten in 2 days. And everything changed in the study there. Last thing, we always encounter challenges that required us to get creative and adaptive. So, I mean, in the housing study, the program rules changed in the middle of the study. We could have said, uh-oh, game over, that's not supposed to happen. But of course, we had to adapt and we had to build in new types of data collection so that we could figure out if the change to the program actually impacted the outcomes. So those are 3 big examples. I have a set of slides next that I will give you at least some of, depending on time, we'll see how many we get through. But I think what I want to do is give you a sense of the flavor of how the mixed methods work actually works. A lot of people say they do mixed methods, and what they really do is they do one thing, then they do the other thing, and then they talk about both in the conclusion. And what I do is I bring them together a lot more. So that's what I'd like to do for a few minutes here. And then I'll talk about a few pragmatic considerations for doing this work, and then we'll move to questions. So this example is going to come from Paying the Price, the second book. One of the things I was very, very interested in was how students used financial aid. I had my own students and I had done prior studies, particularly at community colleges, where I had had students talk about using their financial aid in ways that involved their families. And if you're not familiar with the financial aid system, the way that aid is set up, the whole idea is that there's one arrow, the arrow that's on the left. Parents give money to students for college. That information is reported on the FAFSA, meaning the parent's income is there, because we're supposed to consider the parent's income when deciding what the student needs. And my hypothesis was that not only did parents sometimes not give money to students, but that sometimes students actually give money to parents. And not only that the arrows go both ways, but that getting financial aid might change this. So for example, a student who didn't get financial aid might not be able to give anything to their parents, but a student who does might start giving. Also, students get something from the giving. In other words, there's some reciprocity. So those were kind of my underlying theories about what was going on. Could I find evidence of that in prior literature? Sort of, not in higher ed. Sort of more in studies about how low-income people make ends meet, though. So just because I know some of you are super interested in details, I'll give you just a little bit about who these students were. These are the 3,000 students who are for the centerpiece of the book. All of them were ages 18 to 20. So yes, there are people who are older whose parents are not involved in the aid calculation, but for the purposes of this study, these are all what we would call dependent students. They all started college in the fall of 2008. If you remember that time, it was a crushingly awful economic time. It was the start of the Great Recession. That was not the intention, by the way, for the study to be set during that time. It was just our bad luck. We started planning the study in January that year, and by the fall, the economy had fallen apart. They were scattered across all the public 2-year and 4-year institutions in Wisconsin, and all of them were receiving a Pell Grant. As I noted earlier, 40% of them were also getting some additional grant aid from a private source of $3,500 per year. The ones at community colleges were getting $1,800 a year. The students had an average family income at that time of just under $30,000 a year, which means at least for some, they were below the poverty line. This is Wisconsin, so it is a disproportionately non-Hispanic white sample. And other students, the prominent groups were African American, Latino, Hmong, and Native American. We're talking very, very small percentages among most of those groups, however. And most of these students were, in fact, the first in their family to attend college. I've already described a bit about the data that we had here. I think the most important things, though, for you to think about are that we did surveys repeatedly. We got very high response rates. I hope you'll see there that 75% response rate was due to two major things that we have trouble doing these days. The first thing, this survey reached students first on paper. We put it in the mail to them. This is 2008. We included a pre-incentive of $2. We put a $2 bill in the envelope, and if they did the survey, they got $25. There was an electronic survey follow-up, but the majority of these students did the survey on paper. I still have in storage all of these paper surveys. That was the most important combination, the paper survey and the money that they got. I will tell you that, like everyone else, my surveys these days, I'm lucky with an electronic survey if I break a 10% response rate. And I very rarely have the kind of budget that I had at the time for this to do those kind of incentives. So this study, I'm trying to recall, I believe the total cost for this study, just for the research methods alone, was about $2.5 million over that 6-year period. We had a lot of funding because people were so interested in this topic. The analysis, this is a pretty classic mixed methods kind of a diagram here. You can see both the longitudinal nature of it by showing you the years, and then you can also see the mixed methods part. So the first survey is where we really identified whether the student was giving money to the family, and we talked with them about that in our first interview. We then built trust with them over the next several interviews and pushed further on that topic. We then, on the surveys, asked again about the giving, and you'll see in a little bit how we got into more specific types of giving. And then on the last couple interviews, we probed further, right? So we were using information from one source to inform another, then going back and expanding and expanding and expanding. We started with a few research questions, mainly about those arrows I showed you earlier, and these are the questions that really emerged over time. So which students in this sample gave to their families while they were in college, and what did they give? You'll see that we distinguish between giving money, giving time, and giving emotional support. We also really wanted to understand what it meant to students. There are a lot of people who were kind of pontificating at the time that students are really not in control of their finances. They're really financially illiterate. They're not very intentional. These are characterizations of young undergraduates. And the interviews were suggesting to us that there was a lot of intentionality and thought behind these things. So we really wanted to explore that. And then we wanted to understand the interaction with financial aid. Why use mixed methods? Well, two different things. One, it really fit the study. It made a lot of sense. I always try to use the tool that fits the questions. And second, part of our funding came from the William T. Grant Foundation. Initially, just a large grant that they gave us. And then secondly, I became a William T. Grant Scholar, which included mentoring. And one of William T. Grant's high priorities has always been on mixed methods research. So I'm not saying the funders told us what methods to use, but they were supportive of the fact that we wanted to use mixed methods. They actually funded the qualitative component of the study before anyone else did. And they brought us to professional development workshops and put me in a network of people who could help me deepen this work, which frankly increased my level of commitment to it. So we used a number of different types of analytic methods here. We used triangulation, as I mentioned. That basically means if you get information from 2 or more sources, we look at it together to ask, does it align or does it differ? And what sense do we make if the information is different? We also used it to expand our understanding, so to ask new questions or discover new themes. And then similarly, there was a process of discovery. So that might mean, for example, learning about something we hadn't heard anything about. Learning about the food insecurity of families was something that we found completely through discovery. Measurement was a major topic here. First of all, asking people about money they give their families when, according to financial aid rules, you're not supposed to give money to your families, very sensitive topic. It's a major policy concern, and it's a privacy concern. We had to think about how to ask about this on surveys because we didn't want students who were just giving their moms a birthday present to think of it as they were helping pay for their family, for example. So we worked on using different thresholds for the amount of money and indicating that we meant, for example, giving money regularly. We also offered specific examples of things like time that you might give your family, like time spent caring for siblings or an older parent. And then we were very careful in the interviews to ask how they supported their family, but we didn't say things like, what's it like when you give your parents your student loan money? Because we really didn't want to alienate them or cast any judgment or anything like that. So we thought a lot about those words. So you can see here, for example, what does your family give you while you're in college? And how do you support your family while you're in college? Minor, well, they're not minor details, but quick details for those who enjoy these sorts of things. We used Deduce. Deduce was a brand new a brand new form of software at the time. We actually helped build Deduce while our project was going on using our project, which was cool. And you'll see in a minute some illustrations from Deduce. And then we used Stata for regression analyses. So the first key finding, these low-income college students and their families were relying on informal survival strategies, just like many people do who are not in college. Carol Stack and Linda Burton, very famous sociologists. Carol Stack wrote a book in the 1960s called All Our Kin that was about how people who are trying to make ends meet will actually bring their friends kind of into their family network so that they can not only rely on them for support, but also ask them for money. And it is called Going for Kin, and it is a very prominent strategy, particularly in the Southern communities and particularly African-American communities. In this 1993 work, they call these kin scripts to describe sort of how they happen. And so what we did is we ended up adopting that framework once we saw it occurring, and we started using that language. So part of kin scripts includes kin work, which means like that kind of labor that goes on that can sustain a family. It's collective labor. And we identified 3 types in our qualitative data and then in our survey data: financial kin work, emotional kin work, and time kin work. We also identified processes of kinscription, which means really how do you turn, for example, your child into someone who's doing this kind of kin work with you? Do you teach that at a young age? Do you talk about it out loud? How do you enact it while they're in college? There's a lot of power dynamics in all of that, and so we were really focused there. So now let me briefly show you just a taste of the findings, and then we'll move forward. We analyzed the data for the 50 qualitative students. That's the focus for what I'm going to show you now. We had 222 interviews completed at the time this part of the analysis was done. The majority of the kin work was financial, but time was also a major type of kin work that was done. One reason we're glad we did longitudinal work, the first survey really understated the amount of this kin work going on. So only 15% of the students at time 1 were doing the kin work. But when we turned to survey 3, that rate was up to 50%. And that could be that students do more kin work as they move through college. It also could be that we gained their trust more and they were more honest about it. There is a lot of racial variation in who does kin work, and particularly who feels that they are kinscribed. And as you can see here, the rates were much higher for our African American and Native American populations compared to others. Another way that we looked at the data is we created word clouds out of the transcript discussions about who they were helping with kin work. And what you can see here is the largest word there, one of the largest on the whole page, is mom. The next largest word is brother. And then further down, you can see dad, and in smaller letters, sister. Mom was one of the most mentioned themes in the entire study of paying the price. She's a prominent force in how students experience college, and in particular, how they experience and use their financial aid. Here's another graphic that we did from coding up both the qualitative work and the surveys for those 50 students. You can see here that not only does conscription vary by race, but the type of kin work done also varies by race. The most prominent thing that you see there in the orange is that African Americans were much, much more likely than other groups to be giving money to their families while in college, which is very consistent, frankly, with, as I noted, the earlier literature, and also consistent with the fact that African-American undergrads have the largest financial needs for help paying for college and get the least support. We can also see that when it comes to emotional support, it's less common, but it was the most common for Native American students. And the students who were most likely to give time support, like taking care of siblings, were our Southeast Asian students, who were overwhelmingly Hmong. There are things that this did not help us understand, so we didn't know enough about why they did it, or whether it involved financial aid. So we went further and then examined how they talked about the giving. So here's another word cloud. So what this word cloud, our interpretation of this word cloud, is that the primary way students talked about conscription, as you can see here, it says it's something that we just know. We have to help our families. We were raised that way. That was the most common sentiment that was expressed, that it was a family thing. It was a given. Why wouldn't I do this? Here's another one. This is a particular quote from, this is an 18-year-old man who said, my father just went over it with me, like, you're just supposed to look out for your family no matter how much money you got. If you've got $1 or something, if there's 4 of them and you need to give them something, you just give them a quarter apiece. So he's talking about dividing up the money among siblings. That's how we're supposed to be raised. That's how he raised us. And ever since then, that's how I've been trying to do it. So when I come across, even if it's not a lot, as long as I come across a certain amount of money that can benefit me and my family, I try to do that as much as possible. Okay. That sounds like a very natural, normal way to grow up, with a parent teaching you a lesson. So when you get to college, if that's how you've done it your whole life, and now an aid officer says, don't do it that way, it feels pretty odd. That's why this kind of thing was so important for us to understand. This is just another way to illustrate, and we did this using deduce. We could look at those racial ethnic differences that we saw earlier in the financial kin work and add another axis to it. So along the bottom, it's the amount or the intensity of the conscription. So what we do see here is some suggestion that part of the reason why more financial kin work happens for certain groups is they do feel a stronger sense of conscription. And that's actually most pronounced, we can see here, for Native American students. But even with higher rates of conscription, Native American students still don't do as much financial kin work as African American students, who do it here regardless of how substantial the conscription is. And then we did do a little bit of doing what I call quanting the qual, meaning we coded up the qualitative data and then ran regressions to see if those racial differences were actually statistically significant. And what we found was that yes. So minoritized students were much, much more likely than non-Hispanic white students to do financial kin work. But the racial differences in time kin work and emotional kin work went away once we controlled for other differences like their family income and whether they lived at home and so on. What does kin work feel like? Well, you can see here that both the word stress and the word good are here. And I think that that's a really critical finding that we discovered. It is not the case that students just feel punished by having to help their families while in college. It is a complicated feeling that cuts both ways. So here's one example. Again, this is an African-American man. He said, I'm in the position to help my family out now. It's something that's unexplainable. At times, I probably feel like, damn, I really don't want to pay for this. He went on later to say, I'm having trouble providing for my mom, But in talking about this, he says, I always relate it back to my history, the way they did for me. And that's what makes me want to do more for them. That's what pushes me through college and everything, so I can help them out a lot. For him, again, it's a good thing, it's a bad thing, and it's helping motivate him. There were other students. This is a Hmong woman featured in the book. She was really didn't want to have to do this with her family. Her family really wanted her to keep earning more money, bringing money in, because they wanted to help paying for their household. And so they were pushing her to go into a major that would help her make more money. And she wanted to go into art. And she felt a tremendous amount of shame and guilt that she wasn't able to pay more for her family, towards her family, while she was in college or after college, because she did ultimately decide to be an art major. I will say she's a very talented artist, and I have art in my home here from her. She did ultimately follow that goal. Last thing, when we were trying to figure out the role of financial aid, what we learned was that for these students, aid is money and money is aid. So you really can't ask students to treat the money that is coming from financial aid differently when it comes to funding their families. Another way to put it is all money is green. So, the fact that some money has some rules attached to it and others don't, these things are not segregated in students' bank accounts. If they have bank accounts and when they have expenses to pay, they pull on whatever they have. So a couple of quick things from this example. If we'd only done surveys, we would not have understood the extent to which conscription was happening. If we had only done surveys, we would not have understood what it meant to students. If we'd only done interviews, we wouldn't have been able to see how prevalent this was among a broader population. And if we'd only collected data at one point in time, we would have really missed a lot of the dynamic that goes on throughout college. So what kinds of things did we take away from that study? One of the biggest things is that financial aid, especially the way at which it tries to make students just keep their own money and hold it for themselves, it misunderstands the American family. I wrote a piece about that for The Atlantic based on this work. And there are lots of examples of how this plays out. Second, if we really want to make college affordable, we have to recognize that families need money too. If you take a student's earnings away from a family, or you take a student out of the home, there's a hole that needs to be filled. And third, we concluded that financial aid professionals could probably use some training to help improve their interactions with students and families so that they don't exacerbate feelings of stress and guilt around this topic. Last thing, as I wrap up before questions. Doing the kinds of things that I just described is admittedly very rewarding. This has been extremely rich work. It has been work that I have found myself completely lost in, meaning work that I so thoroughly enjoyed. I've gotten to not only work with incredible data, I've gotten to meet lots and lots of students and have them teach me things. It is also brutally exhausting, difficult work. So it really requires what I would call broad training, meaning most of the things that I did in these studies, I did not learn in graduate school. I was taught in graduate school to do a specific style of survey, a specific style of interview, and I wasn't taught how to do randomized control trials. I went and got training on how to do all of those things. That training required me to do things like travel with a newborn infant and spend 2 weeks in a hotel so that I could take a workshop. It required me to dig in my own pocket and self-fund a lot of this work. I also had to learn how to partner across difference. So for example, in order to do a randomized control trial and get funding for it, because I didn't have that in my resume, I had to partner with an economist who didn't see eye to eye with me on most of the methods, but he gave us the gravitas, I guess so to speak, to attract the funding. Another thing to consider is how long this work takes. Publication timelines are exhausting. So, I started that project in 2008. My book, Paying the Price, came out in 2016. That's far too long a timeline if you're on the tenure track or you need to be rewarded in some other way. And last thing, all of the costs are substantial here. We're at such an interesting moment where research costs are being questioned. And I would say you can do cheap and dirty, low-cost research. Many cases, that's about relying on volunteers, not allowing researchers to really be paid, skimping on incentives to people, but you're going to learn less. And so I am very concerned that we underestimate and undervalue the role of really correctly funding research so that we can get good response rates, so that we can reward and provide proper incentives and so on. As a quick example, we're partnering in a current study that I'm doing, we're partnering with 2 community colleges. In the past, I'd be lucky if I could afford to pay those community colleges $5,000 each to participate for 2 years. Thanks to some changes in how we've been doing budgeting and to the amount of money we can attract, I'm about to tell those community colleges that we can offer them $50,000 each so that they can actually hire some interim or even some student help and also be able to purchase more supplies so that they can build their capacity both during the study and beyond it. Bottom line in all of this research, pick the methods and tools that align with your questions, your skills, and your resources. Don't be afraid to try to do something you haven't done before. Just go get help to learn how to do it better. Whenever you can collect more than one kind of data, that's a safety. To me, that's like a risk management strategy. Sometimes you won't learn anything from one type of analysis, but if you've done multiple analyses, you're pretty much guaranteed to have learned something. And the other thing is try to move beyond snapshot studies to actually capture real world complexity. This is a very weird time to be doing research, but since I started doing research in this way during the recession, it wasn't that big a deal to me when I had to do research during the pandemic. It feels like we're always going through something. And if we've planned for that real world complexity, then we just kind of adjust or pivot to be able to accommodate it. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and take your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. So now we will open up to questions. As a reminder, please use the Q&A feature to ask questions for Sarah and reserve the chat to interact with your fellow attendees. If you'd like to ask a question verbally, please raise your hand and we will unmute you. Ashley, do we have any questions in the Q&A? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. I was saying there's no questions yet, but I do have a question if no one else has one, just while everyone's thinking. So first of all, love the presentation, but how do you as a researcher kind of like reconcile everything that you're learning, understanding that you are interviewing, you're speaking with all these different students who are just in a way just like suffering in different ways? How does that affect you as a researcher, and also how do you, I guess, kind of cope with that?
Yeah. First of all, it's a massive issue. And as you can hear, I faced it from the very beginning of my work, right? And arguably the women that I was interviewing, for the first book when I was still in graduate school, right? These were some of the lowest income people, out there, and they had just had their benefits cut. They were having trouble eating. So I was really fortunate that some of my training and mentoring came from other people who worked with and studied similar populations, right? So the first thing that I did is I turned to ask mentors, what do you do? And I was trained by some folks who frankly go pretty darn far. So one example would be Catherine Eden. When she does research on communities and neighborhoods, she doesn't do it from afar, meaning she doesn't like live in her nice house and then drive in to do it. She moves into the neighborhood and she moves in with her children, meaning that if she's trying to understand the stakes that moms are living with in violent neighborhoods, for example, she's now exposing her own children to those same stakes. And there are a lot of stories that have been written about things that have happened. One of her children got very sick from the living conditions in the house, and so on. What she did, and she has always done, is she engages in quite a bit of reciprocity with the participants themselves, meaning she pays them well, but she also becomes someone that they know and becomes a helper to them, right? So what I mean is they have her phone number, they call her for things. She did babysitting, she did all kinds of things. We had a lot of conversations when I was in graduate school about Does that blur a line around objectivity, right? Does that affect the study and so on? We also had a lot of conversations in that regard with regard to, frankly, white privilege, right? And gender differences and so on. I was already kind of living in that world then, right? By the time that I started doing this work. And so I set out a series of rules and I guess ways of doing things both for myself and my team. The first thing is I never ask anybody for anything like this without compensation, and I strive for the best possible compensation. I've gotten myself in a lot of trouble over the years I hire people with lived experience to do a lot of these, a lot of this work, and I insist on paying them quite well, to the point that I run into HR issues at universities who tell me I'm overpaying people who don't have formal degrees, right? That's all nonsense. I give out my number regularly and I connect people to all kinds of supports. But as I moved further and further into this work, and particularly as my work on homelessness has accelerated, that did not feel like enough to me. In 2016, when I published Paying the Price, I was really, really trying to figure out, like, I had a feeling this book was going to be a big deal. I thought it would sell pretty well. And I didn't feel right about not doing anything for folks, but I also didn't have contact information to like just send them money, right? Like send them royalties or something like that. So what I did instead was I created a nonprofit and I set up a fund where I put money in myself directly from my own income, and then eventually from my book prize. So I won $100,000, if you can believe it, from the Grawemeyer Award. I'm going to tell this because I want you all to understand like what this does to you personally, right? So I'm already kind of freaking out that this money's coming and I set up this way to handle it. I put in $10,000 immediately that first year. I had never given away that kind of money, but I decided let's do it, right? I went on The Daily Show, which was nuts, right? Huge platform. My book started selling, and then I got married to a new guy, and he had to understand that we were going to be giving this money away. And 4 days after we got married, I received this phone call telling me that I had won $100,000. And I sat down on the ground and I started sobbing because I just was so astonished. And that's such I don't understand that kind of money. That was so confusing. And before he even got home, I had decided what was going to happen. And I turned to him and I said, look, I won this thing. And he said, oh my God, congratulations. And I said, before you start thinking about how to spend this money, we're giving it all away. And so we just turned around and donated the whole thing to the nonprofit, which all we were doing was we were doing emergency aid for college students. And we didn't want there to be any red tape considering the paying the price. So we identified faculty at a set of colleges and we gave them grants. And we said, don't ask for any paperwork, don't do any tracking. When you see students who need money, give them money. That was the rule. It's called FAST, the Faculty and Students Together Fund. And so we gave away, I actually leveraged the 100,000 and did a matching campaign. And so we got another 33,000. And Believe in Students is actually celebrating its 10th anniversary next year. We've given away over $3 million all over the country, and we've expanded it into a program with the American Federation of Teachers to not only give money away through faculty and staff, but also to train faculty and staff in student-led training on how to be more caring with students. So it's grown really, really well. The other thing that I do, honestly, is that I've developed a network of high net worth individuals. And when I see a student in crisis, I activate the network. So I had a student in crisis just a year ago. She was completely homeless with her daughter. And in 3 weeks, we got her into an apartment. She's living there rent-free for the next year. There are lots of parts I don't like about this. I just want to say, because it's still charity. It's not a systemic solution. Okay. And so the other part I just want to say to you is that I also feel a very, very big expectation that I advocate for policy change with everything I've got. So you all might not know this, but for example, if you get called to testify before Congress, nobody pays for it. You got to get yourself together. You got to arrange your childcare. You got to get your outfit. You got to prepare your talk, right? And you got to fly yourself to Washington, D.C. It comes at a pretty substantial personal expense. And I've done this so many times. So I've done DC stuff, I've done federal and state policy work. If I'm invited to do something that students want me to do or that I can do for students, I do it. And I think honestly, the policy work is affecting far more people than I could have ever just, you know what I mean, given back to sort of individually. So I know that's a long answer. I hope you can see, for me, this is like a central question of my life. And I get up in the middle of the night and worry about all these people that I, you know, have crafted a life thanks to them sharing their stories with me.
That was a great answer.
Okay.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
I was
Yeah.
nodding. I was like, oh, great. I'm so glad I asked this question. But in the meantime, other people have added
Yeah.
questions to the Q&A.
Yeah.
And that there was someone who did ask the name of the mentor that you mentioned. If you wouldn't
Yeah.
mind dropping that into the chat.
Sure. Yeah. So let me give you some names, and I'm not going to say that anyone is, you know, like completely getting it right in my view, right? So her name is Catherine Eden. And she wrote a book called Making Ends Meet that was very, very important to me. She's written a number of others. I also want to mention, some of you may know this person. There's a sociologist I went to graduate school with who I became very close to, whose name is Alice Goffman. And Alice wrote a book that became a major story in the news because of the way that she handled the West Philadelphia men who were selling drugs. And so I was very close to watching the ethical/unethical practices that were going on there. And so because she was someone that at the time I was really good friends with, I had to, you know, I guess like being that close to something that controversial and that difficult, it ended our friendship, but it also was very important to my own thinking. So I think that's important for transparency. I do see I have a direct message question as well, which
Oh
I'm
no,
happy to
that was
answer.
just one of the questions that's in the Q&A.
In the
So we
Q&A,
can
great.
start with that one and work our
Yeah.
way down.
So are any of my current projects being affected by research funding cuts? So the answer is only one of my projects is being potentially affected. And I want you to understand why, right? So several years ago, I left the university research setting very intentionally. I had come to the realization that doing the kinds of things I do, particularly around the hiring pieces that we were just talking about, and around having the nonprofit and being an activist, did not sit well with university employers. They found reason to dislike almost everything that I was doing in that way. And so I decided that rather than just keep banging my head against the wall, I'd already earned tenure, I'd already been a full professor, I didn't need that, that I would go out on my own. And so I have been on my own now for going on 3 years. And what that means is that I choose my partners and I do my research primarily through Education Northwest, which is a firm out on the West Coast. And I don't, very intentionally, I'm not the PI on anything. I'm a co-PI on one thing there. If I had still been at the Hope Center, because the university emphasizes getting federal money because they like the indirect cost rate. If you look at my grant portfolio at the time, we would have had a really big problem right now. My grants would have been cut. We would have been in a financial hole, and I would have had to initiate a lot of layoffs. I have always preferred philanthropic funding because I find that the federal government doesn't understand my work. They used to tell me that what I do is not educational research. So had I been there, that would have been the situation. What I have right now is I'm a co-PI on one NSF grant. It is about basic needs and security in Washington State. And so far, they have not flagged it for a cut. But of course, many of the words on the warning list circulating at NSF are in fact there. And you know, I think that if it gets cut, we will fight back by taking it to philanthropy for funding. And if it gets cut entirely, then we will hit pause and continue it just as soon as that we can. But I am very, very grateful that my financial circumstances are not depending on that the way so many of my good friends and colleagues are. So that's what I'd say.
Thank you.
I see.
Did you
Go
want to
ahead.
move on to the next question? Now that you have community college respondents, what are some of your thoughts about it?
So when I have community college respondents, so I've always had community college respondents in my studies. I think the person's asking me, because now I teach at the community college. Is that, I just want to get clarity. I think that's what's meant, and I'm happy to talk about that. This is the greatest gift I've ever given myself. Teaching at a community college is so unbelievably rewarding as a teacher. And as somebody who's studied community colleges for a long time, it's so great to actually get in the setting and discover all kinds of things that I didn't know. So I'll just give you like maybe two quick examples. So the first thing is that I understand better than I ever have why it is that we need to give the community college resources if we're going to do studies with them. And I understand the extent of the resources needed and how it's not just possible to just drop quick cash in and have that make a difference. The other thing is I'm seeing even more where the data is wrong. The data are wrong, sorry. The data are wrong on multiple levels. So there's a lot of data, for example, that say X% of community college students have a disability. Now that I'm a community college teacher and students come to me, I can now see how many do in fact live with disabilities and have those things, but the school doesn't know about them and they're not recorded or reported anywhere. And it's largely due to resource constraints. So yes, so they've been diagnosed. Well, they've either been self-diagnosed or they've been diagnosed by a professional. They'll come and they'll tell me that they have something, that's what they live with. But then I'll say, does the school know? Right? Do I need to do an accommodation? And they'll say the waiting list to get an appointment is 3 months. So no, right? So that's like just a really wonderful, first of all, two things. One, I love that they're telling me so that I can work with them. And as I'm allowed, frankly, I just do a lot of universal approaches in my classrooms because I'm not allowed to do accommodations for students who don't officially have accommodations. But also it's helping me think about new research topics. So that would be another example. Yeah. Let's see. I can do one that's really, really quick. The Education Northwest is not a REL. Education Northwest lost its REL several years ago, so it isn't going to be affected in that way, although it certainly was affected when it closed. That was long before I got there. So that's an easy one to answer. Now that I operate outside of institutions, what do I think of IRB? I have so many thoughts on IRB. Well, first I should tell you, Education Northwest has an IRB. So my work is still all IRB approved. That said, what blew my mind is that I thought that the Education Northwest IRB asked better, more thoughtful questions and operated at like 10 times the speed as any university IRB that I dealt with. So they put me through the ringer. I had to move a study from Temple University. And so I did that university's IRB. And then I did it over at Ed Northwest. And I was amazed that they thought through, a quick example, they thought through the reading comprehension levels of the survey questions that I was asking in a way that I'd never been asked at Temple. The surveys had already been collected though, so I was late for that. And their processing time, like my entire IRB review took like less than 3 weeks, which at Temple could take 3+ months. Now, admittedly, it's, these are different structures. Let me give you one other example, though, of the kind of things I think about with IRBs. So as you can hear, I do have a history of doing these studies where some people get a resource and other people don't. And it's hard because everybody needs them. And my take on that is the following, right? First, if there's any chance that we could give the resource to everyone, we should. If we know that the resource absolutely makes a difference and we have science that says that that's the case, even if there isn't enough, we shouldn't be denying it. Okay. The resources that I've been working on are ones where, number one, there's absolutely no way to give it to everyone. So nobody's actually really being denied. Somebody's going to be denied, whether it's first come, first serve, or whether it's through randomization. And two, we're doing the studies precisely because we don't actually know the effects. I tried to start a study when I was at UW-Madison that was a partnership with a community college in Milwaukee. And the idea was to test whether part of the reason that community college students get low test scores on their placement exams, which end up putting them into remedial mathematics and such, is because they actually didn't know the exams were coming and really hadn't eaten before the test, right? And in K-12 education, we know that if you give children a snack before a test, they get higher scores. This is why if you have kids, you find out all the time, they'll send notes, right? Please send your kid with snacks, please send your kid with candy. So all we wanted to do was set up a snack table for some of the testing sessions, just not all the sessions, right? So we didn't randomly assign people to get food. We assigned sections to get food. UW-Madison said, no can do. Totally unethical, totally not doing that. I just so happened to be changing universities at that time. So I said, I'm just going to hit pause. I went over to Temple, filed the same application. And not only did it get processed and approved, but they wrote me a note and said, thank you for doing this research. It's really important. We really do need to know these results. Now, I mean, I understand in theory we could have bought food for every testing section, but it's a really pretty big college and that really would have been substantial. And I was doing this on virtually no funding and the college wasn't offering to do that. So, from an ethical standpoint, I really wasn't that concerned about some testing sections not getting granola bars and fruit. But I really was struck that according to one IRB, this was unethical and should never even happen. The other one went so far as to say, thanks for doing it. I don't know what to make of this. It doesn't feel to me like we are following a common rule book.
While we're on the subject of IRB and ethics, I see we have another question about IRB. As your understanding of your participants changed over time, did you have to go through multiple rounds of IRB review as you changed the questions you asked in surveys and interviews? And if so, how did that process go?
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, most of these IRBs have to be annually reviewed and updated anyway. So one thing that I've learned is to do this in a very streamlined and pragmatic way, right? So you make changes timed well with those annual updates and you put them all together, right? Like all in one package. So there's a lot of efficiency to be emphasized in that. Otherwise, you are filing changes all the time and you can't move out and do the next thing. So that's, I think, the main thing. The other thing is, I think a lot of people file IRBs applications and they write them in ways that are, for lack of a better word, they're very academic. And you got to remember these folks are busy and they need to see exactly what you're going to do and why. And so learning how to submit clean, clear applications. I had a lot of, staff members who I was working with, and we really worked very hard on that. I would soon learn who was really good at doing these and use them for all of my applications because we would be very streamlined, right? So I think that's the thing. I find that there's often far too many words written in the draft, and I have to cut that way back so that it's succinct and people don't get distracted with other stuff. What else? Let me take Josh's question and then I'll go to the one from D. Do I feel that giving money to students may somehow conflict with the academic mission of higher ed? I imagine it benefits students tremendously. However, is there concern that this undermines the benefits of higher ed? Okay, that's a really interesting question. Let me try it from a couple of different angles. First, let's just take the general topic of the question of whether money itself and the need to pay for college is undermining or interfering with the work of college. I would say yes. We have gone from an understanding, at least among some, that learning is a good thing, period. That lifelong learning is a good thing, right? That if you get to the next part in your life and there are things you want to know or more worlds to be exposed to, you ought to be able to, right? That curiosity is a good thing, that reading is a good thing, right? These sorts of things. We've gone from that to a system that says you have to go engage in a specific kind of schooling in order to get access to what people call good jobs, and you have to pay for it. And you don't only have to pay for it, you have to pay a lot for it. In other words, you might even have to go through some real pain to pay for it, pain that could cost you years later, frankly, could even reduce the quality of your life. That's what they're finding from student debt. And not only that, but some will tell you the pain is good for you. So there are some very sketchy claims out there that students who pay more for college have skin in the game, a phrase that I have enormous problems with. It's offensive on many levels. It's also not scientifically sound. There really isn't evidence that students will take that higher price and have that translate into, for example, higher motivation and a fire lit under them. What it translates into is stress and time away from learning. So I'm also concerned related to that then that we've narrowed the purposes and therefore also how we fund college based on the economic rationale for it. You're just supposed to believe it's an investment that will pay off. That's not the strongest case for higher ed. There are plenty of people who go to college and get degrees who will never see an economic payoff. And those people are the ones who are most likely to go. In other words, the children of the wealthy. So the people who get no bang for their buck from attending college are the people whose parents went to college, the people who have white skin, the people who already have a lot of money. Of course, almost all their kids go. This is the hardest fact, right? So if we really wanted to do the economic rationale, if we really wanted to have a department of efficiency for higher ed, we would focus on sending the people to college who are the most marginalized in our society without it. So that's the first thing. The second thing, the federal financial aid system, since its inception, was supposed to be about paying for college and was not supposed to interfere in the academic mission of the college. Okay, it has failed. And one of the topics of paying the price is a chapter called Making the Grade. And it is about the pressures that students face to get specific grades to keep their financial aid. And while many faculty are accustomed to being told, I got to get this certain grade, please give me a better grade, I got it right, they see it as grade grubbing. What they don't understand is how economically consequential it is for the individual student, and also how the most likely result of a problem is that the student switches out of something they wanted to study towards something that they can simply get higher grades in, which undermines the whole premise of higher learning. So there's this very specific set of rules called satisfactory academic progress that I would argue means the federal student aid has actually violated the law in getting into the business of colleges and universities and learning. And I would like to see SAP abolished completely. I think the idea that feds need to say whether or not students can keep their financial aid in that way is way out of bounds, and I'd like to see that pulled back. So I hope I got towards the heart of your question with at least part of that response, and feel free to ask another one.
See that this participant maybe raised their hand for a moment and then put it back down.
Okay.
Okay. Well, we do have one question left, which is, do you interact with academic libraries in community or four-year colleges and trying to learn how librarians could do this type of research? And then some further context from that. participant, finding a mentor in order to undertake research in higher ed seems to be very difficult. It has been hard to find faculty researchers within my university's library system. I'm wondering if it has to do with tenure track versus non-tenure track hiring.
Well, okay. So first, I've had some interaction with librarians, mostly because there's been a growing interest of librarians in addressing students' basic needs. And so I have been to conferences, for example, where librarians are at the table trying to figure out whether they could help students navigate things like access to public benefits programs or community resources. So that's been great. I've held countless sort of like research conferences, right? And built research teams and advertised for staff and advertised for partners and so on at both of the universities that I was at. And I don't recall ever having a librarian asked to become part of that. By the same token, it's not that I reached out to ask. So I very much hear what you're saying. I think there are enormous structural problems inside universities that are created by all of these different tracks, all of these different terms. So for example, who gets to be called a researcher in an institution? Who is called a teacher? Who is called a faculty member? I'd prefer faculty just call themselves teachers because that's what students think about, and it's much more accessible. And I think that we should recognize that research is happening in tons of different places and in different roles. For that to change, I think, unfortunately, would require a lot of proactive work on the part of, like, as an example, right? I know plenty of people who are trying to build teams to do research now. They don't like doing research in isolation. Research is not as well done by themselves. If you were, for example, to reach out to someone you wanted to work with who maybe was on faculty, who, and said, I'd love to play a contributing role, and, I have this specific skill set, I would think that majority of faculty would be very interested in that, truly. I think the question for most of those folks around partnership really does come down to a lot of bottom line type of questions around salary, right? And payments and so on. But I know there are certain faculty who certainly have, plenty of elitism and snobbery and you're not in the right place and all of that jazz. But I would, my rule of thumb is 1 out of 4 is like that, 3 out of 4 is not. So go for the 3 out of 4, like err on the side of at least asking. And anybody who doesn't want to work with you because of your title in that way or something like that, they're not worth working with anyway. It's okay. That's what I'd say. I know I would have welcomed it if I mean, I've done so much outreach in the last several years in particular to get more community college institutional researchers and so on onto teams, because it's invaluable to get these other perspectives onto a team. And anybody who wants to do this kind of labor and finds it rewarding, I mean, why wouldn't you welcome it? It's more hands on deck. Okay, so there's a really hard question in the chat about the future of higher ed. Oh, I would sound naive if I said I wasn't worried, right? I'm just going to say this. I have embraced hope as a strategy for a very long time now, almost 20 years. I've read the science of hope. Hope works. If we think everything's over, like if we think this is doomsday and there's no future and he's going to be in charge forever and everything's going to be awful, we might as well just give up. So that's the first thing, is I really, really do encourage you. I've been communicating with friends who live in regimes all over the world, terrible regimes, oppressive regimes. They still find joy in their everyday life. We're going to have to find it. That's the first thing, because we have to keep going. 2, I'm approaching 50, and the closer I get to 50, the more I just say, we've been here before. We've been here before. I mean, and I will say, it's mainly the Black women on my TikTok and Instagram feeds who keep reminding us of this, and we should very much listen. This is not the hardest time we've ever been through, nor it will be the worst that we ever see. And I think we need to build some some stamina and some backbone for those of us who feel like we're just going to collapse, because we also need to recognize, personally, this is my take, higher ed is going to suffer right now. Yes, it is. But who's really going to suffer is all the rest of it. Like, I'm more concerned about people who will be hungry and people who will be homeless and people who will be deported and people who will be violently harmed than I am about what's going to happen to our colleges and universities, to be perfectly honest with you. And so just keeping that very organized in my thinking has been helpful. We can't activate on every front. If you want to activate on the research funding front, please do. But if I have to choose right now, right, where I'm going to put my time and attention, I'm putting my time and attention towards mutual aid and advocacy on the biggest things, like who's in our data and shouldn't be right now. And I'm not going to spend time crying tears for Columbia or Penn or any of those places that have the endowments to protect themselves. Hope that helps. You didn't invite me to be shy, did you?